So our next speaker is Hoyt Long, who is his co-author Richard Chanzot. Has a paper called Network Science and Literature History, and I think it's about Japanese literature, if I remember right.
Great. Yeah, I've got the mic. Thank you, Max. And to the rest of the committee for inviting us here today. We're really pleased to just have an opportunity to share some of our very beginning stages of some work on a project that tries to apply network analysis techniques to the visualization and quantification of poetic networks in Japan, the US, and China. One caveat, I think we might be the odd folks out here in that we are actually humanists and trained literary scholars who, to borrow Roger's phrase, are backing into network science or jumping off the cliff into network science. And so our project is relatively low tech, and we're just pleased to have opportunity to share it with folks who can help us build the technical and quantitative dimensions of the work. Just to begin, a quote from Ezra Pound, just a reminder that the desire for quantification even amongst folks in literature is not anything new. He was faced with this collection of poetry, magazines, and periodicals. He wanted a better way to arrange it. All he had was big boxes in which he sorted them, but he was after a kind of a more scientific and accurate and mature arrangement as a way to make sense of all of this material, of all of this data. I want to just answer two questions for our project. Why network analysis? Well, for the first part is because we think it can help us isolate certain aspects of the social structure of literary networks, and that this can then help us to redirect and deepen our readings of texts. So it's our framework is very much a sociological one. In literary studies more generally, and also in sociological approaches to literature, there has been a kind of a resistance to empiricism, despite the desire for it from long before. And so we're trying to, in a sense, engage with numbers to see how it might open up new questions for the literary archive. There have been a few exceptions, some work that has been done using empirical methods in which we draw some inspiration from. Second question is, why poetry? Why do we choose this as the test case? The period that we're interested in, which is basically the pre-war period, the late teens to the 30s, there was this boom in little magazines and independent coterie journals, which essentially helped to organize poetic activity in the modern period. So these journals have an inherently social dimension. They bring together certain types of artists and poets based on their literary styles, their political affiliations, and whatnot. So that's the first reason. The second reason, it's a global phenomenon. These periodicals become kind of a global literary currency, and so it allows us to think about network issues in multiple cases and transnationally. And also publication networks in these poetry magazines are fairly easily turned into network data. So essentially we use the fact of publication as an explicit tie linking a poet to a journal, with the assumption that submission to a journal indicates some kind of affiliation, whether positive or negative, with the other people who are submitting to that journal. There are complications, of course, the fact that we're dealing with historical data, so fears about incompleteness, although the data for the US and Japan is quite good. And also, for humanists, the reduction of dimensionality, that inevitably we have to reduce texts to objects. Certainly not all poems are created equal, and yet we have to essentially treat them as such. But we're aware of these complications as we move into this kind of work. And essentially, the network-based questions that we have and that we think we can pull out of the data, one is very simple. Do avant-garde publication networks, do they resemble small world networks? We assume that they probably do, but are they more small worldly at some times than others, or in different places? How do network topologies confirm or contest received categories of literary history and classification? The larger question, how much was journal publication actually a measure of poetic affinity? Can we find some correlations between where authors published and something about the nature of the poems that they published? And were some publications able to hold some groups together more tightly than others? And one final question that we've become interested in is, can we identify cases where the network position of a poet correlates with literary reputation or with the known stylistic tendencies of a poet? So is there some correlation between network structure, position in the network, and literary form? We're particularly interested in brokerage and closure. So just to give you a sense of the data, it's fairly small scale. We're inputting, none of this is digitized, so we have to do this all by hand. But for the Japan case, the index we're working with has about 100,000 entries, 4,000 poets, and 167 journals. And we've selected a subset of that. Same with the US case. And the China is a little bit more difficult, but I'm going to show you just one slide just to give you a sense of what that network looked like. So there are really two aims of the project. One is just the use of visualization as an exploratory tool for basically raising new questions about literary history, for discovering figures who have not been canonized, and also just for getting a sense of the social dimensions of literary form. When we do the visualization, even at the level of static images, in some cases they really confirm what we know, such as that during the late teens, the American field of poetry was quite dominated by certain high modernists who gathered around Poetry magazine there in the center. But that about a decade later, the field of modernism broke into various competing factions, namely a group called the Fugitives on the upper left and the Harlem Renaissance poets on the far right. So the network image certainly confirms some of the things that literary historians already talk about with reference to this period. We have similar things. I'm going to skip ahead here just for the sake of time. Similar things are confirmed in the Japan data. The China data, you can see, is radically different, essentially because there aren't any good indexes, so we've had to work backward. We've chosen a set of journals and then constructed the data from that. But even at this provisional stage, we're seeing that it does confirm certain things we know about literary societies in Republican-era China, which is that they were highly fractious and that there were there was very little overlap between them in terms of cooperation and brokerage. Here's just the visualization. So at the same time that they confirm some things, they also raise some new questions, challenging questions for us. One, just a very general sort of differences in network topology and morphology. Here you see a comparison of the US data, the Japan data, and the China data. The journals are in yellow and the poets are in gray. Other questions that it raises for us are in terms of tracking career trajectories of poets. Oftentimes we literary historians talk about certain poets as if they belong to a particular field, like the anarchists, the high modernists, the surrealists. And what's interesting for us is to manually, color the nodes according to those categories and then watch how those change over time. So in the 28-29 case for Japan, what we have is a pretty clear bifurcation of these groups into sort of three sections. But that 6 years later, these colors seem to make less and less sense. There's a lot more mixing and blending. And so this raises some really interesting questions for the literary historian. Are the categories that we've been applying, are they correct? Or what is it about this particular period that didn't allow for those categories to look like we would expect them to? And then, of course, using the features of the network, we can automate the process and let algorithm detect communities for us. I did this for a projection of the data. These are just the authors seen through their connections through journals. And in fact, this community detection is picking up things that we know about the period, which is that these four poets broke off from the poets on the left, in the blue. And so it's certainly picking that up, but it's also raising certain other questions about why certain figures were in were placed in particular groups. So, and then another thing that we're interested in are these figures who seem to span certain structural holes. In the American poets' case, some clear instances are these two poets, Laura Riding and County Cullen, who are lesser known and yet seem to have a very important place in the network structure as bridges between cliques. Of course, visualization is limited. We know it can only take us so far, so we're also interested in exploring some of these questions through network science, through sort of formalizing our questions into network science problems. One of the things that we run into initially is that we're dealing with weighted two-mode networks, and we want to make sure that we are able to use the richness of that data, that it matters how many poems somebody contributed to a journal. And there's been a lot of good work on weighted two-mode networks, but we wonder, as literary historians, how analogous our data is to, for example, Southern women and events and parties. Is it analogous to scientific collaboration, Broadway musicals, actor-movie networks? Where in this work might poetic networks fit? So we've been using the TNet software package to run some of our models. I'll talk about just a few of the measures that we're interested in. One is the clustering coefficient. What's interesting here is that when we run it on the US data, it actually confirms what we would expect given the poets that we've put in, and that is that after 1922, there is a significant decrease indicating that there are more clusters that are less connected. And this is something that literary historians and observers at the time clearly recognized, that modernism was fracturing, that something was very different about the field. We're also interested in the question of when we develop these measures, the question of projection. And this is actually a very humanist question, which is to say, when you want to know the value between two poets through the journals, how do we decide what that value should be? How do we weight that relation? Should it be the sum of the number of times that they published? Should it be equal to the minimum between them? So if poet A publishes 5 and poet B publishes 2, should their connection to each other be 2? Or should it be something yet more complex, which would be something like Newman's method, which would weight them dependent on the total number of contributions to the journal? We think it's probably closer to something like 3. We don't have the complete data set yet. So we've been sort of playing around with these different projections. And one of the features we're interested in is betweenness or bridging. To what extent does a poet kind of broker between groups? We've run betweenness measures on the projections for the minimums, using the minimums method and the sums method, and sort of put that into a heat map just to get a general sense of who's more between and when. And we noticed some significant disparities between these methods, but also it's helpful to know that it is in fact picking up, for example, this figure here seems to be a fairly consistent broker during those periods. And in fact, when we go back and dig deeper into what's been written about him, he's often described as a kind of broker-like figure who jumped around between different groups and was good at negotiating different cliques of poets. So hopefully, our long-term goal is really to use these kinds of measures as a way then to jump back into the literary archive and rethink some of the categories that we typically apply to literary history. I'll go ahead, I'll just leave this slide up. These are some future directions, future sort of network science questions that we want to begin to ask as our data becomes more rich and complex. But I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and we'd love to hear any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Let me wrap up a little bit because I think it's necessary. So if I understood well, your networks were you had poets on one side,
Yeah.
and then you had journal or volumes of publications, and you were looking at the co-occurrence of these people across these volumes.
Right. Yeah,
And the
it's
volumes were
spiking,
actually basically years of these things.
That's right.
So, okay. So that's something which is, I think, in any networks talk, even if you're among network people, should be pointed out at the beginning.
Yeah, I felt rushed for time.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're essentially dealing with weighted bipartite
And
affiliation graphs. Yeah.
I agree that, so basically one thing for the rest of the audience who considers this, like stuff like this a flaw, right? So you have to imagine if you come out of the humanities field and you self-learn this kind of stuff, this is something, if you're not exposed to like hundreds of networks talks, that's something which happens. And but a related question, so if you have a bipartite network of poets and poem volumes,
Journals,
what or journals, how could you come up with the concept of brokerage? Because it's like say James Brown did a couple of singles in 1967, and there is a guy who also has a couple of singles in 1967, and James Brown and some other guy published in 1983, and then according to your concept of brokerage, then James Brown would broker between, say, I don't know, Wilson Pickett and Michael Jackson. How can you? That's not something you can work with, right?
Yeah. Just to get at that question, we really think, because we're dealing with, basically it's the poems themselves, the texts themselves are our connectors. We're thinking about brokerage as not by the individual himself, but through literary form, so that if there's a poet who's publishing in the Harlem Renaissance journals and then also publishing in Poetry Magazine or some of the other periodicals where there isn't any mutual overlap, then our question is, does his writing somehow reflect a certain hybridity? Is he in a sense spanning a certain stylistic gap in the field?
Like bridging genres or something. Okay, makes sense.
Exactly.
We actually are. We have 2 more minutes for discussion, so open for questions.
Alexander Mehler from Goethe University. But I would like to continue that question. But would then this mean that you would need to look much more into the documents themselves before you can state that there is a stylistic relation between those documents?
Right. So that's ultimately, we're thinking about this as network analysis as a kind of a tool for discovery. So that it's by identifying these features that we couldn't see just by looking. We can't read an index to poetry. We can't read all the poems. But the question is, so we identify these figures, then we go and look at their poetry. And sometimes their position may correlate to something stylistically. Sometimes it may not. But without this sort of 10,000-foot view, we can't even, these figures wouldn't even pop up, or they wouldn't even register for folks. So that's really our goal.
Okay, I don't see any more questions, so let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you.